Hi. Now we will discuss about physiological principles in terms of biomedical engineering point of view. So first, let's discuss about systems approach. So we can consider human body as a system which requires inputs from outside for sustained operations and outputs. So converting food and air and water into energy and body mass for normal physiological function. So to understand our physiology in a systemic way, we define the concept of engineering system and system boundaries and the differences between open and closed system. Also here, we will discuss about the concepts of homeostasis and steady state, and we want to distinguish equilibrium from steady state. And the concept of a system or system approach is we define a system under our study or our defined boundary as a system. And then we consider about system balances in the context of systems physiology, including respiratory and gastrointestinal physiology. So let's talk about the mass balance. We all know that mass conservation concept, which is mass cannot be created or destroyed in general, except nuclear fusion or fission. So the concept of system as an engineering analysis, we want to define system boundaries. And that boundary means a physical sites of intersection between the system under the study and the rest of the world. So this is really dichotomous way of defining our interest as a system and the rest of the world. For example, we can define system as a human body, and kidney, or single cell. And when we define a system, we also consider the characters of the system as a closed system or open system. So that depends on whether we allow the system to exchange the matter with its environment. So for example, let me show one of the system conceptually. So this surface as a control surface, I mean, we have defined a controlled surface. So inside is our system, and that we call sometimes control variable. And outside is environment. In this case, when it's open system, there are materials or physical quantities can pass through, like this arrow shows. So that can enter, the matter can enter into the system, or the matter can go out of the system. So in this case, it's an open system, but there are closed systems which do not allow exchange of matter, which would be a much simpler case. So in an open system, we consider mass balance. So that open system allows exchange of mass across these system boundaries. Then we consider only about inside the system, how much of a mass will be accumulated or changing. So that's our main interest. Then let's think about what's possible in this system, how mass can be accumulated inside. So within the system, the rate of accumulation of mass inside system, let's put as ACC. And that accumulation can have various ways. First, let's think about through the system boundary, and there could be some mass getting into the system. If it's a human being, we drink, we intake food, and that can become this in, or the rate of flow of mass into our system. And also we can consider through the boundary out of the system. So that, for example, we urinate, and or this makes the mass from the system to the out of system. So that we define as an out. And also something we can consider is what if that particular mass can be created inside the system. Mass may not be the right case, but depending on what our interest is. For example, like heat can be generated within the system, or heat can be lost within the system. So that we put as a generation minus consumption. So generation or consumption is the rate of mass generation or consumption within the system. So this generation minus consumption means the overall net rate of mass production within the system boundaries. So this relationship really defines the mass balance with an open system, which will be used for our future analysis of a system. Before getting into a more analytical way, I want to define a flux. So flux is in Latin meaning flow. And this has been a useful concept, especially in transport phenomena, for example, like in fluid dynamics or mass transfer or heat transfer. And it's very simple. The meaning is the rate of flow of a property per unit area. So flux needs certain area for the property to pass through. So the quantity of flux is very simple. So the unit of the flux is the quantity of our interest per unit area per unit time. So it's a quantity per unit time per unit area. But sometimes some people do not consider the area as included in flux. So you gotta be careful in terms of context. So let me show an example of flux visualization. So let's consider an imaginary ring through which we are interested in how much of the quantity passes through. So for example, let's assume these arrows shows the photon of light. So if the same rings over here, and if the density of the light or photons are twice here, you can see with a given time, with a given area of the ring, there may be 3 photons pass, and here 6 photons pass. So flux is proportional to the density of flow. What if the imaginary ring is now oblique to the angle of the incoming this quantity, such as photon? So in this case, you can see from the distance between these arrows or photons, the density of photon are the same. However, this area become tilted that we can see while 4 photons pass through per unit time through this area, while here 6 photons passes through. So even if the density is the same, however, the boundary angle facing to direction of flow matters. So flux varies by how boundary this area faces with respect to the direction of the flow. And lastly, regarding to the area. So if the density of the photons are the same, if we have a different size of the area, we can see through this ring, there's only 3 photons, while this one 6 photons, assuming that this area is twice. So flux can be proportional to the area within the boundary. But this last one is a little problematic because I define flux as the quantity per unit time per unit area. So this one doesn't matches too much, but if we are interested how much of photons are passing through with through the ring, this is how we can think of. And in general, the quantities of our interest may be more general, such as it can have a vector field through the space, such as this. Then now the area or the surface orientation matters, which is described in the second part of here. So for example, let's say these are the vector field of fluid. The blue arrows show the distribution of fluid, And we are interested in the flux through a defined surface, which we define here as a green. Then at this surface, excuse me, the F, the original vector, tangential vector, which is represented as a yellow one, we can decompose it into a perpendicular component and tangential component. And think about this tangential component, which is parallel to the surface, so it never passes through the surface. So this component doesn't matter in terms of flux. So what matters in flux is that general flow directions normal component or perpendicular component contributes the actual passing through this surface. So only the perpendicular component and not tangential component contributes to flux. So keep this in mind. Now let's think about our body. So from engineering point of view, I defined the system as defined under the study. So how to define the system is upon us. So we can have multiple choices how to define system. Let's consider our body as a system. Then there are multiple choices. For example, so this is a drawing of the body, and you can see this gray one as a body and what's in and out of the body. For example, this is lung or respiratory system, then oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. And let's consider from the mouth to anus, this is called digestive tract or gastrointestinal tract. Then think about through the mouth, nutrient, salt, and water gets in. And through this digestion, we actually excrete unabsorbed matter and waste. Also, the other part is in this circulatory system, which collects oxygen and exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. And through circulatory system, it provides through this renal system or kidney, giving the waste product. And through this, urine comes out. So organic waste, salt, and water can pass through. And so in this way, we can consider this as a system. But on the other hand, we can define our system really the epithelial layer of our body. Then technically this from the mouth to anus, that's digestive inside can be considered outside of the system. So that new definition is represented as a blue here. So we can define epithelial tissue as a system boundary. Then these are system, and inside the mouth to GI tract can be effectively considered as out of the system. For example, in the lung, this is lung alveoli, and that can be technically environment. Of course, in the kidney, this can be defined in this outside of the world. So there are ways to define system boundary under our study. And here, depending on that, the arrows represent the movement across the boundary. Once we define in this way, the GI tract, that exchange of, let's say, food molecules through inside the digestive system and out of this can become like considered, while in gray system, it doesn't matter. So really, how we define the system and system boundary can change the way we analyze the system. So our body is a biological system, which is like a machine, and the maintenance of our body is very important. And that the maintenance of our conditions, which is necessary for our life within our body's internal environment. For example, sodium concentration or blood pressure and body temperature need to be consistently maintained. And that property we call homeostasis. And an important strategy for our body to maintain our homeostasis is a feedback system, especially so-called negative feedback, which means when these parameters gets higher, we have a system to put it down. When it becomes lower, then we put it higher. So in negative direction, feedback allows us to keep our homeostasis. And multiple feedback mechanisms are operating in our body to maintain our steady state condition. What is steady state? We call a body is a steady state when the parameters that define our body do not change over certain period of time. For example, like mass or temperature condition, like we know that our body mass doesn't change much, then that's a good time, it's a steady state. And another descriptive word for this is equilibrium, which is a state of perfect balance. And we need to be careful using equilibrium versus steady state. For example, molecules in chemical aspects, molecules are still in motion within a system at equilibrium, but there are no changes in the composition of the system with time. And when we call equilibrium, that can refer to, let's say, chemical equilibrium, just like described here, or physical equilibrium, such as when there's a physical body, the net force from the outside becomes zero, then the mass or the body can stay the same. And it's a force equilibrium, or energy state can be equilibrium. And the important aspect of equilibrium means if the system is at equilibrium, it will stay the same forever. And we think about our living body. In fact, our living body as a biological system cannot be at equilibrium until our body died and then decomposed, and it will not change because we are consistently making, let's say, ion concentration gradient to keep our body working and making, and that's not an equilibrium state. So to give you a little bit more explanation for this, a process, I want to give you a steady state, but not at equilibrium, an example of this. So steady state means a not changing with time over some time of interval. So if the system is not changing over time, some time interval, we can define as a steady state. Let me give you a simple example of a house which has a furnace. In a cold day, the heat generated from the furnace will heat up the house. So the temperature is high while outside the temperature low. So that heat flux from the furnace to inside the house can become the same as from the house to the outside. Then the inside, the temperature of the house can be maintained constant for a while. That we can call as a steady state. However, if the fuel runs out, eventually it will happen from the furnace, then only at that point, the temperature between the house and the outside environment will reach the same, and there's no net heat flux between the house as a system and environment. So in that case, we call it as an equilibrium. So the house is maintained at constant temperature, and that is a steady state, while this is not an equilibrium state. But eventually, this can reach thermal equilibrium. Let's consider another example. So here, we have a big reservoir of molecules, and there's a membrane between them with a small chamber, let's say. And the concentration is higher in this darker area compared to lower area. Then, through the membrane, if there's concentration difference, the diffusion will make the movement of this molecule through the membrane from high to lower concentration. So there occurs a flux from high to low. However, these concentration of this chamber from this chamber can be maintained for a while due to the presence of a huge reservoir. Then this state can become known as a steady state. On the other hand, eventually, even if these reservoirs run out of changes and the concentration of molecules become the same, there's no net flux. And this is called equilibrium state. So all of this is to describe homeostasis in physiological systems in our body. So we consider like about 4 physiological systems, and we'll discuss about the homeostasis. So for example, respiratory system is through our lung system, and that provides oxygen to the circulating blood and removing carbon dioxide from blood to the outside. So that mass material transfer is happening in the respiratory system. What about digestive system or GI, tract or gastrointestinal system? What it does is maintain a balance of nutrients in the body by mechanical and chemical digestion. And what about circulatory system? We can consider 2 kinds of circulatory system. One is cardiovascular system, and the other is lymphatic system. So the cardiovascular system, in fact, providing oxygen-rich blood from the lungs and to the tissues or cells, and collect at the same time waste. So that's the circulatory system keeps our homeostasis. The lymphatic system maintain the fluid balance in our body by collecting excessive fluid from the body and also drain into the heart. The kidney system, renal system, what it does is eliminating waste and end products of metabolism through generation of urine. And very important function of the renal system is it controls the fluid volume of our body by regulating sodium concentration and by direct elimination of water from the body by filtering the blood plasma and generating a urine. So thank you for your attention. Now, before finishing, I want to give you an exercise solution. So it's an application that how much water is generated inside our body is a question. So this is an example, and very curiously, we can consider an experiment of a human subject can be monitored for the following quantities. So we want to know how much water is generated in our body. Then maybe we can define the system as a human body, and then we count all the input and output of water. And by this, we can consider how much water is generated inside the body. So over a 24-hour period, let's say we are in homeostasis. That means our body water doesn't change over this time of interval. So we can collect the data and count how much of water intake. So the intake of water consumption in food and drinks of this person, we measure it as a 2.1 liter. And through the kidney, we generate urine. So we measure the amount of urine per day as a 1.4 liter of water. And of course, there are other ways of the water to leaving our system boundary. So for example, sweat, maybe 100 milliliter of sweat is lost per day, and in breathing itself contains humidity. So about 350 milliliter of water can be lost during the breathing, and other kinds, for example, feces, and 450 milliliter can be lost due to others. So think about this. By using this data, we can consider how much of net generation of water or consumption inside the body. So here's the sample solution. Remember, through this system boundary, the mass balance, the rate of accumulation comes through the boundary inside and outside of the flux. And then the net is the generation minus consumption. So in steady state condition, accumulation will be 0. So our interest of how much are being generated as a net is generation minus consumption is the out minus in flux, which is the water lost in our body and water intake. And we reached the conclusion about 200 milliliter of water is as a net generate every day per day in our body. And we can consider this water can be produced or consumed by chemical reactions within the body. For example, condensation or hydrolysis in the formation of peptide bonds between amino acids. You remember that a generation of protein polypeptide bond formation. And thank you for your attention.